Welcome to this landscape design basics video. My name is Zac Roberts. I am the conservation coordinator at Weaver Basin Water Conservancy District in Layton, Utah. The goal of this video is to give you some tools that you can use to be intentional in how your personal landscapes are designed. One of the more frustrating things about starting a project is knowing where to start. If you have a good plan, then that makes this so much easier. The first step of developing a design is creating a base map. A base map is a representation of the area that you will be designing. In this example, we will be using a typical residential landscape. The first step of creating a base map is to measure important landmarks and features in your project area. You'll see that here we measured the property lines. We've measured out where the house sits on that property, along with the shed, driveways, and those dimensions of that property. After you've measured everything in your project area, you want to take those measurements and draw them on some paper and using a scale. To do that, you can use a measurement like 1/8 of an inch equals 1 foot, or 1 inch equals 10 feet. That just helps you to make sure that your base map is proportional. Just make sure that your scale allows for your base map to fit on your paper. It's also important to show what that scale is on your base map, as you can see here on this drawing. After you've created your base map, one thing that you want to do is make multiple copies of that base map. We're going to be using that base map for some different things throughout this process. One thing that we'll want to start with is what we call a site inventory and a site analysis. The site inventory is taking just note of everything that you have in that project space. The shed, where the trees are, existing vegetation, where things are like areas that have poor drainage, where the shade is in your house or in your yard, the fences. Take inventory of things that you enjoy about your landscape, like great views. Take inventory of things like, this fence is really close to my neighbors and I may want to provide some screening or some shading here. Just analyze what you have on your site. Some good things to be aware of are slopes in your landscape, where the sun and shade areas are. If you have good views, we want to try to maximize those views. But if you also have things that are maybe a little unsightly, let's think about how we can screen those areas. Areas with soil drainage issues are concerning. Also, all of your existing plants. One really important thing is, especially in older homes that have overhead power lines or utility lines, note where those are and where they come into and connect to your house, because that will limit any type of structure or tree planting that you can use in your yard. Also, take inventory of where your windows are in your house. If you have a sink in your kitchen that has a window over it, pay attention to what you're looking at out that window, so that if you're ever doing your dishes, you have a good view of what you have outside from your kitchen sink. Some of the tools that you can use for a good, successful design are what we call the elements of art. These are the tools that are going to help your design be successful. So the elements of art are the visual components of the landscape, and these are the elements that make your design successful. So there are 7 of these elements. There's line and texture and tone. Tone can also be referred to as shade. And there's shapes, colors, forms, and space. So we need to think about all of these things when we are making a design. And how we use them is also important. Here are some examples of how the elements of art are used in a landscape. So as you can see on the left, we've got some different shapes that are working together in the same design. There's different tones or shades of the same color. Green, the different shrub beds there in the circles are different shades of green, and they also are a different shade of green than the lawn areas. Moving over to the next picture, there's some very definite and defining lines in that landscape. Another way to use those elements is having different textures, having that soft grass right next to a hard texture, so you have that hard and soft texture, and it'll feel different. And then again, another line moving through a more natural landscape. A tool is only good if you know how to use it. And so the principles of design, as you can see here, are the way that we know how to use the elements of art. The elements of art are great, and they are the tools that we can use, but the principle of design help us to know how those elements should be used within our project. So there are several of those. Using pattern, maybe repeating a line or a shape, contrasting different things. I love to use contrast in my design, and using contrasting textures, contrasting colors, contrasting textures, even going from a hard to a soft texture is also just really great. You can emphasize those elements of art. If you want to have something be a focus for you, then you can have it stand out by using some different techniques to emphasize that. Balancing is great, using a proportion or a scale and making things look larger or making things look smaller. Harmony, rhythm, and movement. Lines work really well with movement. They really guide your eye to different elements in your design. So here are some examples of how these elements of design are used in a landscape. That large middle picture here, you can see that bench uses some lines to move your eye to what you want to focus on. And if you were to just look at that picture and notice where your eye goes, it will most likely end up at that shed in the background. And hopefully, if you're leading your eye to something, that something is worth looking at. And so another thing that's used very well here in this middle picture is the pattern of the pavers in there. Other ways that you can use other elements of design is creating an emphasis. By using a perspective, we are emphasizing what is at the end of that fountain in the bottom left picture. The fountain has the pots leading up the stairway, and those lead your eye to the middle of that fountain. There's also balance there with pots on both sides, and if you've noticed that there's a little bit of an emphasis on that one pot that is not like the others. The bottom right picture really shows a good example of contrast, contrasting textures, contrasting forms. The project area, all of the architectural elements are very rigid and hard feeling, and the landscape is used to soften that hard edge and the hard feel of that landscape and that building. It's important through a design process to think about how you want to use your space, and decide what you want to include in those spaces. So make a list of all of the things that you want and you need in your project area. What's important to you? Do you have kids that need a place to play? Do you want to grow vegetables? Do you want to provide habitat for animals and insects, pollinators? Do you want large shade trees? Do you want a lawn to play on? What are those things that you want in your yard? Of course, we always are promoting making those elements water efficient to conserve water. After you've made your list of wants and needs and you have decided what elements you want to have in your landscape, it can be tricky to know exactly how they all fit together. And so you need to find a style and figure out what type of style speaks to you. There are a lot of different styles. You can go something that is a little bit more organic or more geometric, formal or modern if it's eclectic, country garden. So try to find inspiration to what type of style fits you and your personality and your use. And there are some great ways to go about that. You can look in magazines. You can look in Pinterest. Pinterest is a bit of a rabbit hole. If you're not careful, then you can get lost on Pinterest. Lastly, we have a conservation garden here at our Layton campus. We demonstrate different types of landscapes. We can show you what plants look like throughout the year. If you come at different times of year, you can see what plants look like throughout the year in the different seasons. So feel free to come up to our garden and take a look around. After you have made your list of elements that you want to include in your yard, it's a really good idea to make a concept plan. And a concept plan is taking your list of wants and your site analysis and starting to put those pieces into this puzzle. So with your site analysis, you'll look at where your sunny areas are, and maybe that's the best place to put a vegetable garden. Or where's your shade, and maybe we put a seating area under the shade. Look at those different things and start to put them almost like bubbles in your base map, in one of your base maps. What you can do then is start to move things around in your base map, in your layout of your yard, to make sure that everything fits and that there's some good connections between this use of your yard and another use of your yard. Make sure you think about how you're going to be moving through your yard by drawing like these arrows here in this diagram. They just show how that movement is going to happen through your yard. So those may be good areas for trails or pathways. You make those connections, make sure that the element of your yard, how you're going to be using that space, fits with the analysis and the inventory that you've already made. When it comes to the placement of elements in your design, it's really important to think about what you want your yard or your project to really emphasize, and what are the more important parts of your design. And so I like to think of it in three different parts. There are the skeleton parts, the more structural parts of your design. Those are the elements that are most important, that you want your attention to be drawn to. They are the elements that really provide the structure of your design. So they are your trees, your activity zones, and other focal points. And we'll use this design here as an example to show these different elements of the design. So in this one, you can see that there are several different things that are really focal points. And you have a tree, several different trees, and different areas that are unique and different, and the eye gets drawn to those different things, and they really stand out. Those are the most important elements of this design. After you've decided where your structural elements are, we need a way to connect those. And so we'll use different ways and different elements, different plants to connect one unique structural element of your yard, of your design, to each other. There are different things that you can do to do that. You can use smaller trees, larger shrubs, paths and border plantings work very well to do this. But then also repetition, using those same things throughout your design will really help to make your design connect to each other, but also be cohesive and show some good tying of one element to another element. In this design, I've pointed out some of those where we're using the same plant or similar plants to show some connection. The paths also work really well to really connect those accent points. Your structural elements in, and you've added your connecting elements, you're going to have some space left over, and it's a good idea to use this space and fill it with materials that are going to contribute to your design, but don't take away from those structural elements and the complementary connecting elements to those structural elements. And so I like to think of what to put in those areas as a fill material. A fill material is used to contribute to the design, but not necessarily to take away from those other elements that you really want to have your eye focus on. And so they tend to be where your eye rests when it is looking at a design. Those fill materials tend to be shrubs that aren't really showy. Evergreens work really well in this type of application. Perennials, even plants that just have more of a foliage, and it's not necessarily a showy plant. Ground covers work really well. You can even use non-living materials as a fill, like a bark mulch or a gravel or something like that. I caution against using lawn as a fill material, just because lawns really should be planted for function. They should be used and intentionally placed so that they are used. And sometimes less is more. You don't have to cover every square inch of your site with some type of material. After you feel comfortable with your concept plan, it's time now to make those design elements a little bit more concrete. And you can start doing this by finalizing that concept plan, using those design elements, the elements of art and the principles of design, and taking your styles that you've decided on and really drawing in a final design. And that final design is to show what you envision your project to look like. And so this is what typically landscape contractors will use to construct your design. So a typical landscape will have two different types of design. They'll have a planting plan that shows the exact placement of your plants, which varieties they are, and then it'll also have a separate plan that shows the irrigation and how you see the design of how water is going to be delivered to the plants that are in your design. Irrigation designs are a little bit more technical than a planting plan. A planting plan shows more so how things are going to be laid out. If you need an irrigation plan for your yard, make sure that you are using a professional who has some irrigation design background. We recommend someone who is a quality water efficient landscaper or a QUEL certified landscaper, or someone who has gone through an irrigation association training for irrigation design. Plants are such a major element of a landscape. Let's talk about how to use plants in a design. The showstoppers for any design in any landscape, but let's make sure that we're using them properly. We need to consider a few things when we are making decisions on plants. For example, what is the light requirement for that plant? What is the water requirement for the plants that you want to use in your landscape? We want to group plants by those types of requirements. If a plant is a heavy water user, then you want to group it with other heavy water users. If it is a drought tolerant plant, then you want to group those plants together. You don't want to intermix, because what you'll end up having to do is water to the plant that requires the most water in that area. So you might end up with several plant lists, and you want to create those lists and group those plants based on those requirements. I also like to consider soil requirements. Some plants really like a different texture or a different alkalinity of soil, whether that soil drains water quickly or if it holds on to water more easily. That's something really important to consider. Once you have gone through some catalogs or gone through the internet and found some plants that work in your landscape, you'll probably need to group them into some different groups, and you'll end up with some different lists, whether those plants are full sun, part shade, full shade, drought tolerant. You'll want to use those plants in different areas of your yard based on your site analysis that you've done. Another thing that you want to do is vary your plant heights in your lists. Show what those plant heights are. Group those plants in those lists, maybe taller plants at the top and shorter plants at the bottom. What are the flower colors? What are the leaf textures? What are the leaf sizes? Those are all very important. Also, bloom times. Don't buy plants for their flowers. Buy plants for their leaves, their texture, their shape, their color, because When the flowers are gone, you're going to be looking at the leaves of that plant for most of the year. And then as you are laying out your plants on your final planting plan, one tip is to group those plants of the same varieties in groups of odd numbers. So one, if you have a nice ornamental plant that you want to have be a focal point, have that be all by itself. You can group that one, leave it by itself, or you can group plants in groups of 3, 5, or 7. I found this diagram online and I absolutely love it. It just shows how easy it is to use plants, use different plants together. I love to use contrast as a way to create interest. Using color is a great way to do that. You can use color as in lights and darks and the shade of the same color, or you can use complementary colors, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But using the size of the leaves, the texture of the plant, there are tricks and ways that you can lead someone's eye or grab somebody's eye by just using plants in certain ways. For example, if you were to have a small space or a shorter space and you wanted it to appear longer or deeper than it actually is, then one thing that you can do is put plants that have a larger leaf closer to where you would be standing, and plants that have a smaller leaf further away from you at the back end of that area. And so it creates almost a forced perspective of the plants that you have closer to you and the plants you have further away. Makes it appear that that space is deeper than it actually is. Using texture in plants, having fluffy plants next to some sharp feeling plants or spiky plants are also great ways to create some interest. Chances are that you'll want to go up and touch the fluffy plants. And then contrasting forms. Some plants are very narrow and upright, and some grow more horizontally, and using those to guide your eye and almost as a line to guide your eye to some element of your design. As you are deciding where plants are going, I recommend making sure that you look at the plant sizes at their mature size. Don't go to a nursery and pick the cute plant that is in the pot, because chances are that plant is going to grow up. It's almost like going to a pet store and buying the cute puppy only to have it grow up to be a Great Dane, and just the dog doesn't fit the space that you have. Chances are that a cute plant will grow up and be larger than the space that you are providing for that plant. So make sure that you're looking at those plant sizes and making sure that you give those plants room to grow. As you can see in this picture here, there was a tree that was planted next to this house. That tree is right up against the house. I mean, it's basically being invited to dinner with how close it is being next to that house. Initially, when you buy your plants, you are going to have a lot of space between your plants. And when you draw your plan, make sure that you're drawing your plants at that mature size so that you know how many plants that you need, and that you know where those plants need to be placed, so that when you go to the nursery to buy your plants, you have a good idea of which plants you need. And as you lay those plants out after you buy them, you can get a good spacing your yard is going to look a little bare. There's going to be some space between the plants, and that is okay. You know what those plants will grow up to be. Usually with shrubs and perennial plants, it takes maybe a year or two for them to fill in those spaces. When you're laying out your plants in your planting plan, draw them so that your plants will overlap a little bit. You don't want to have a 2-foot plant 4 feet away from another 2-foot plant so that they just barely touch. Maybe overlap those flowers or those plants so that they can move one plant into another plant. Using color is especially important when designing with plants, and we're going to be looking at a couple of different things with our color. We're going to be looking at the leaf color, but also flower color, and what we want to do is use the color wheel when we are making our color choices. If you look at the color wheel, there are colors that are on one side of the wheel and then the other side of the wheel. The colors that are directly across from each other are called complementary colors, and they are as opposite as those colors can be on the spectrum. So a red is a complementary color to green, blue, and orange, yellow, and purple. They're all complementary colors, and complementary colors can be used to really contrast the color of those plants and really bring some attention to one color or the other color. So something that you can use in that contrast, you can use tall plants versus short plants. You can use red leaves versus green leaves. One thing that I have done a lot is I've used what is called a color triad, where you take a set color like a red and you look at the complementary color that is opposite on the color wheel, and then you move one space to the right and one space to the left of that complementary color, and those are the colors that you use as plant or the color combination. That works really well, especially with blues and oranges, yellows and purples. Greens tend to not work quite as well with that color triad because most plants have a green leaf. But you can use that color triad in a lot of different ways. It works very well, especially with flower colors. Another thing you want to take into consideration is a color palette. Whether that color fits on a warm scale or a cool scale. Warm colors are all the reds to yellows, whereas the cool colors are more the blues, purples. Some greens can be considered warm and some greens can be considered cool, just depending on whether that green leans a little bit more to the blue or the green leans a little bit more to yellow. Here are some examples of a warm color palette and how plants are used in a warm color planting. You can see that there's a lot of yellows, there's a lot of reds, a lot of oranges in these examples. Warm colors are used typically as a way to excite and to energize. They are inviting and they are welcoming. And so the warm color plantings are best used when you want to spend time in that space but be more active in that space. So if you're thinking about using warm colors in your backyard where you want to spend some time maybe around your lawn so that it's a little bit more inviting, it's a little bit more exciting, and you want to be a little bit more active in your yard. Here are some examples of some cool colors, cool color palette. And of course, there's going to be a lot more purples and blues in these examples. Cool colors are more soothing and more calming in nature. So if you want your space to be more relaxing, I recommend going with a cool color palette. Favorite ways to think about and approach a design is, how am I going to engage with the landscape, and how is that landscape going to engage with me as I'm moving through it? And I like to increase detail where people are going to be. And this picture is a great example of that happening. You notice that there's a pathway moving through this picture, and look at where all of the color is. Most of the color is next to that path, and really that path is engaging in more of your senses. You're looking at some really detailed flowers right at your feet. It makes you feel like you want to pause and take in that detail. Really look at that. Also, there's some plants that are planted next to that pathway that look like they feel soft. And so that's another way to go about designing, is think about how you can engage more of your senses by moving through that design. Looking at the colors and how they're going to catch your eye. But also think about fragrances. Are you going to brush up next to some lavender and then just feel and smell that lavender? And it sometimes hits you in the face. But then also plants can be really soft feeling, and you can't help but reach out and touch those plants. So putting those next to where you're going to be moving through your site, or spending time next to them, maybe even planting plants next to a seating area that are going to rustle, so that you're hearing those plants move within your space. Just a great way to approach a design is having it engage with your senses. When you have your plan and it's ready for installation, it can be a little intimidating to think about doing it all at once. And maybe your budget doesn't allow for it to be done at once. And that's the great thing about having a plan in place, is that you don't have to do everything all at once. So you can divide your plan into phases and get all of one area done before you move on to your next area. Another thing that is beneficial about phasing it in, especially if you're doing it by yourself and not hiring somebody to do this, is that you can learn from your experiences of doing a small area and then apply those lessons that you've learned to those larger areas. So one thing that if you are going to phase in your project, then things that you'll want to consider is, start with your irrigation installation. Make sure that that is installed everywhere in your yard. Also, plant trees. Your trees are going to be an investment in your landscape, and so you want to get them in your yard as soon as possible. There's an old proverb, but I think it's a Chinese proverb, that says the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time to plant a tree is now. And so invest in those plants that are going to be an investment for your landscape. Also, you want to prioritize the areas of your yard that you want to use most. If you have kids or dogs or other pets that need to use lawn, then maybe that's what you plan to be in one of your first phases. Again, just start small if you're doing it by yourself, and work up to those larger areas. If you're having it hired out, really consider your budget and what you can afford to install before moving on to the next phase.